Yesterday, we looked at cultural responsiveness. We looked at a variety of speakers giving us all the different ways and strategies. Today, we're going to look very specific communities of color, looking at the specific strategies, cultural competency, and cultural responsiveness that we all need to be able to serve our people in need. So, the first one is, this is going to be about examples from immigrants in the Bay Area. African immigrants in the Bay Area. We have two very accomplished speakers, Dr. Dorothea Duval, psychologist and Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at San Francisco State University. And if you saw the video yesterday, you realize we have been very fortunate at A Safe Place to have her experience and her kind of expertise. Then we have Nunu Kidane, who is Director and founding member of Priority African Network. And they have a presentation where they're going to not only talk about what they're doing, but also engage you. So, Dr. Duval.
I'm going to be in dialogue with my good friend over here, Nunu Kandani. And just let me give you a little information. She's going to be modest, and she's not going to tell you all the work that she has done. So I guess we met about 20 years ago now. It's about 20 years ago. And maybe longer than that, the tail end of the Free South Africa movement. And Nunu is from Ethiopia. And we started talking, about issues and the differences and the similarities between the African American community and the African immigrant community, and that and I was telling her that as a young person, I grew up in New York, and there was a lot of love for the African community, but then I was a child of the 60s, and at the time that I was growing up, the African countries were becoming independent, and there was a lot of that energy going on in the East Coast and in African American communities supporting the independence of Ghana, of Ethiopia, of Nigeria, of all of the countries becoming independent at that time, and that there was a lot of community interaction and going back and forth. And then just fast forward 20 years, in the 80s, she started talking about how her children and her being an African woman got a lot of prejudice, a lot of bullying, and a lot of negativity from the African American community towards African immigrants and African people, and it was just like I couldn't figure that out. What had happened in 20 years? And we know what had happened in 20 years. There was a crush on information and on news, and a lot of our kids were not as savvy and weren't as informed about what's going on in the world. They took history out of the schools and all of that stuff. So people weren't. So we thought we'd get together, and with a group of other friends, African American Africans, we started this Priority Africa Network, which started dialogues. So for the 10 years, we did community dialogues between the African immigrant and the African American community, so that we could foster, and also so our kids could grow up and have a better understanding, because there's all this African pride, but then when you meet real people from the continent, you treat them negatively. So we started these dialogues, and so that's how we got started. And the organization evolved, and how it relates to today is that we realized that there weren't a lot of services for African immigrant people, that they were coming to the United States and there wasn't a lot of crossover. There wasn't a lot of welcoming. You know, people who come to the United States come through the State Department, and if anybody knows anything about the State Department, it's not Black friendly. So it's not black friendly for African Americans. It's not black friendly for people who are coming from African countries. So there wasn't a lot of support. So that's how Priority Africa Network got started, and then it's branched off, and it has a lot of other branch organizations. One is Black Americans for Black Alliance
For just
for
immigration.
just immigration, and different organizations stirred out of that. So, in talking about developing, Nunu has done a lot of work in the community to get resources, and this is how we got to the issue of domestic violence, and that people coming here, just like people living here, have the same conflictual relationships, but when you come from a different country and you come from a different culture and a different language group, how it is handled is completely different. And as we know, as people of color, that not always are the laws of the country supportive, the values of the country and not the values that you necessarily have. And so the ways in which people heal and work through these issues can sometimes be at cross purposes with the helping institutions that the institutions that are supposed to be helping institutions. So as we know, some of the similarities that exist, that there is this adage in the African American community called "We do not air our dirty laundry in public," and that came out of being in a hostile society, in a segregated society, that African Americans in mainstream society are already targeted as aberrant, criminal, have dysfunctional families. Everybody knows about the Moynihan Report, have dysfunctional families. So when families are trying to deal with crisis within their family, like domestic violence, like child abuse, or like sexual assault, these things, families try to keep them together. They keep them silent. They don't want to talk about them. Well, that's threefold when you're coming from another culture, when you're coming from a group-oriented culture, when you're coming, and when you are an isolated person within this culture. So there's some similarities and there's some differences that we found within the culture, and Nunu has worked very hard with African immigrant families to get people not acculturated, but to be able to use the institutions and the systems in a culturally appropriate way that doesn't demean the family structure, but also gets the help that people need. So, as a way of introduction, I'm going to ask her why she chose to focus on African immigrant communities, and what does she see as the difference between African immigrant communities and African American communities when it comes to the issue of domestic violence.
Good morning, everyone. Really pleased to be here, and I have profuse respect and thanks for Dorothea and also for Caroline for inviting me and the Priority Africa Network organization for us to be part of this conversation. Because we say time and again, when immigrant communities are identified in these kind of spaces, it's never African immigrants. Our numbers are growing. Some of you know that within Oakland in particular, but the Bay Area in general, this demographic shift that's happening. There are more African immigrants in the United States, in California now, than anywhere else nationally. Let me repeat that again. There are more African immigrants, even higher than New York, in California, than anywhere else in the United States. And this was reported in the 2010 census. And we have a lot more work to do in the 2020 census to increase the visibility and to have more spaces like this to engage in conversations about what does this demographic shift mean? Because we are immigrants, but we are Black immigrants. And given the profound reality of what race means in the United States, when you combine that with an immigrant status, there are many multiples of conversations that need to be had. So let me just say thank you, that I'm glad to be here for this purpose. And then secondly, to put a disclaimer that I am not an expert in this field. The area where I come in to speak on this is as Dorothea said, when we started Priority Africa Network, and we began a program to identify different associations and community groups, and to bring them, many of them, to the table, to look at what are the priorities that the communities are dealing with, what are the issues. These are lessons that have come to learn firsthand from the community groups that I will be sharing, but I'm not an expert in domestic violence or in any kind of therapeutic care. The last part, I probably don't need to put it as a disclaimer, but I will. When we keep using the term African immigrants, just keep in mind we're talking about 54 different countries in Africa. There is no African person as such. People carry their ethnic identity, their national identity as their primary identifiers, and that's where the conversation starts. And sometimes there's a bit of a challenge when we kind of generalize and homogenize communities that are quite distinct depending on the region, from west, south. Less than, I thought it was 3. But Exactly. There are different languages, different cultures. So just to kind of keep that mind frame. So coming to the question of why this community, partly as Dorothea said, I was born in Ethiopia and I came to the United States some 30 years ago. And it was in that process of self-discovery. What does it mean for me to be a Black woman, an immigrant woman in the United States, and then raising children? I have boys, which many of you will know the distinction why I'm insisting that there's a particular attitude towards Black boys that I came to learn and see and then reread the history of the United States within a racial framework that I did not know. That was really significant, both as an immigrant and as a Black woman. And that was what brought me into the work when we decided to have a platform or a special session that dealt directly with African community groups. The first challenge was just identifying who are the groups that are here and how are they constructed, how are they structured, and then gaining enough trust to be able to begin to engage with them and having them trust us to come to the sessions that we were putting together. And I'm proud to say we are the only organization that work in this model of not just service delivery, of having people come in and resolve their housing issue or their immigration issue or their health issue, but to have community groups gather with their representatives and they sharing with us what their priorities are. So you have a Sierra Leonean community right next to a Nigerian, next to an Eritrean, and this is the first time that people are actually meeting across these national, ethnic, linguistic divides and realizing the commonalities of the agenda, both the experiences of what brought us here and how we're trying to figure out how to live here, and also overcoming challenges.
So also, we decided that we'd like to do this dialogue, so it is open for questions. So if you have any questions what we've already spoke about, please feel free to, ring out. And if you have any questions while we're talking, just feel free to. We believe in call and response, the African way of being in the world. So tell me. What are the cultural dynamics that might impact a woman who is a victim of domestic violence? And we call it a survivor.
So I guess with the communities that I was working with, primarily the Eritrean, Ethiopian, and to a degree some of the Nigerian communities, where I engaged with more closely, when and this is probably true about immigrants in general, but I'm going to speak about the experience with these communities. People come to the United States with profoundly high expectation of, all my problems are over, I am finally in America. There's equality, there's job opportunity, there's fairness. This is the lens that really frames immigrants coming to the United States. So there's a bit of a shock when people see poverty, homelessness, but that shock is mitigated by thinking, well, they must be lazy. They're just not working hard enough. I came here with nothing, and look at me, I'm working hard and I'm trying to make it type of thing. But the lens, that framework is important to understand, because the majority of the women, the immigrant women that I have worked with, get it really quickly that there are opportunities and openings for them here than there were back home. But they're trying to figure out how to use this chance of having employment, gaining income, while also maintaining the home structure where the father or the man is the patriarchal head, and negotiating those cultural norms that they bring back home. So the women tend to learn English very quickly, and seek employment, which tend to threaten the male. So the structure begins to kind of get challenged. So that's one thing. The other thing is almost exclusively every community, and this is across, probably true about immigrants again in general, but every community immediately identifies where that ethnic or national community exists. So almost no one functions as an individual. You find out where your people are, and you attach to yourself to that community. So you become a member. You are less alienated. You speak your language. You feel very comfortable because you are cooking, your traditional food, and there's a sense of belonging that is immensely important from that alienation of being in this land where people are speaking a culture and I don't understand, and values that are different. So the good thing is that support base is incredibly critical for people to sort of transition into this new world that they are a part of. But that world can be also constricting, incredibly constricting, because the values that are practiced at home are enhanced and supported, right, within that space. So whether you go to the Eritrean community or the Sierra Leonean community or the Ugandan or the Congolese community, when there are events or gatherings, the women are the ones who are cooking, right? They're preparing the food, and the men sort of perpetuate this space, a male space, that they have had back home, and they're drinking beer and maybe watching TV, and the women are bringing the food. And so these are, on the surface, somewhat
Traditional roles.
traditional, but I don't want us to be quick to judge these spaces, because they are immensely important in enhancing and supporting the women through a very, very difficult journey of personal, familial, and all that. So when there is a problem, typically within the family, it's highly unfortunate that the first point of intervention is usually a neighbor who's calling 911 to report that a man is beating his wife. So it's taken out of the community sphere, and suddenly it's projected into this kind of public space where the woman is being rescued. I worked as an interpreter for Tigrinya and Amharic languages for years and years as well, which have given me sort of insight in terms of how, once it's taken into this space, either by phone or in person, the authorities keep insisting to this woman that you're in America now. You have rights. You do not need to put up with this. she's operating from a framework of he is my husband, he has a right to beat me, or he has a right to a degree to my body, which is kind of culturally reinforced. And so those conversations are going this way. Not really communicating is what I'm saying. And then to make matters worse, members of her community, particularly the women, learn about what just happened. And the way it's talked about is she took him to court. She brought in outsiders. So she is shaming us. It's no longer just about him and her. She's shaming us because now we have to deal with this issue. So the pressure is on her to drop the charges. And many of you know that in this kind of reality, she couldn't even if she tries. But she is now held for that and usually ostracized. And to be ostracized from a community, when you're an immigrant, that is your home base. That is a very precious space. And so rather than risk that, other women are not going to step forward to when there is a problem, when there's a domestic abuse or even child abuse is going on. There's a tendency to say, I'll take it to the elders. They will talk to him. And because that's what's done at home from within that sphere. Mm-hmm. But again, it's not black and white. It's not clear, or we should be less ready to judge, because that space that supports that woman is something that can be for good, although it can also be incredibly limiting and sort of judgmental within the cultural sphere. So I'll stop here, and perhaps we could. I'd speak more later.
Any questions?
I just wanted to know who set the rules in the family or in your groups in Africa that they can only handle their affairs among themselves. Those limitations. She can't tell anybody outside he's beating her, or the elders have to get it. Where did they set that at?
These are culture-based, kind of. It's not as if there's one person, but it is a male-dominant culture for the most part that views the man as the head of the household. When there is intervention, the elders are usually men who intervene. So it's not as if it's it's not condoned for a man to beat his woman. This is not culturally acceptable.
Okay.
But the point of intervention is never her taking the issue outside of the community. That's where the challenge becomes. And neither the police nor the social services never consider bringing it back into the community to resolve. It becomes now a legal issue, right, in this country. And this is partly the challenge when I go back and forth home a lot. And there are some really dynamic women lawyers who are bringing this issue that when a man beats his wife, say if we take Ethiopia as an example, the police don't get involved. She could be coming bloody, near death, and they will say, well, you need to take this to the elders. So this is how it's always been practiced, and the women attorneys now are saying this is a violation of physical, human, civil rights, and this is a case for the police to intervene and to hold a man accountable. But culture does not shift because of one or two issues or one or two cases, right? These things are sort of added on, and there are some shifts happening, but it comes from home, which is what we practice here.
Who are the elders and who appoints the elders? Where do they come from? Is it a religious group or is it a political group? When you say elders.
Typically, it's members of the community that are literally older. and their role is to have peace and a balance within the community.
So it's not religious
It
based.
could be religious, it's more cultural, but it's definitely not political.
I think we can see that in African American culture, that it's a most cultures in the world are group oriented.
Right.
You know, this culture is individual oriented. So the the balance point comes from the individual and then to the group. Most of the world is the opposite. It's the group. You are part of a group. You're part of a family. You're part of a community. You're part of a country or a neighborhood. Then you're part of a city. But you're a group. We look in the United States. People look at themselves, and the laws are developed on the individual basis. But in most cultures, it's a group orientation. So you are part of the group. And when you go out of the norms of the group, and so to think about the norms of your own group, to look at that. And when you go out of the norms of the group, then the whole culture feels out of balance. So you're creating a wedge within the natural functioning of things when you take something out of the group. So people have so they look at that from that perspective. Here in this perspective, like it might be good for the whole neighborhood that I clean my sewers, but they're my sewers. I don't have to clean them. So I don't care about how it's going to affect my neighbor over here or my neighbor over here, but that's not the way most people live. So when a woman, to look at what Nunu is saying, when a woman talks about domestic violence, she is not, and we see this in the African American community. She's not only talking about her husband is abusing her, now she has, on some level, disrespected all the men in the community, the whole culture. So now the whole community, and we understand that being black people in an institutionally racist society, one black person's behavior becomes the behavior of the entire community. Only white people can live as individuals. The rest of us live as a group. So, I mean, when you hear about a crime, the first thing you're saying is, was he black? And that's because, so we also have that group mentality, but it has been institutionalized in an individualistic culture, so we're a little confused about it. We go back and forth about where our allegiances are. So what she is talking about is that, yes, people see themselves as part of a family and an extended family, not a nuclear family. They see themselves as part of a community, as part of a culture, and change happens very slowly. Abuse is not accepted within the culture, but how it is processed in a different kind of way. And I'll just be quiet.
To add to Nono's point, you have to consider the structure of the African communities. Back there, it is tribal. And the concept of the police, the authority, the judge is new. It came with the colonial system, just in the 50s. And it's not only shame for the wife to take her husband to the court. Even if you take your brother, your neighbor, that perceived as shameful. The police is a stranger concept to them. They don't acknowledge it. There is the chief of the tribe, the aunt, the elder, whoever elder, even if your third door neighbor, can resolve the issue. It doesn't have to be an organized group or religious group or anything. Just an elder have the respect to talk in any conflict and resolve them. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for that.
The question I have is, like, with us being an outsider looking in from someone that's part of like that type of community, what is it that we can do to pretty much not have them ostracized from their community, but also if we see, say, one of our friends getting beat, what is it that we can do to pretty much have it where justice is in their favor with them not being ostracized from the community?
Hello, Donna Whitmore with the Oakland Housing Authority. So what are the solutions that you've come up with? Because once it does enter the criminal justice system, there's an altogether different set of rules. And I'm not hearing any solutions of how you're going to deal with that situation.
Good morning. My name is Akiba Davis. My question might tie in with his question. After a member is ostracized for going to the police, how is she helped by her community? Or she totally has no more communication with her community?
No, that's not it.
Typically, yes, a woman will feel the wrath of her community if she transcends to bring this issue anywhere outside. How she re-enters differs from one group to another. She usually will. There's just a different process. But it could be very traumatic. It could be that, she's completely cut loose or has no more ties. And that could be mentally seriously damaging to her, to the children, to the family in general. We don't work typically with individual cases, as I said. We refer them to someone else and provide interpreters and cultural kind of understanding and context, but we work with community groups that work with us, which is the perspective I'm speaking of. In terms of solutions, I have to put another disclaimer that this is a broad topic with so many different communities, so many different cultures, and so many different realities that I am sort of reducing to this session. So with that, I would say, when the 2010 census was being conducted, Priority Africa Network was approached by 3 funders because we were the only organization, as I said at the beginning, that was working with actual community groups. You know what they say, that trusted partners? I mean, literally there was this challenge. We need to get African communities to vote. We need to get them engaged in the census, but we don't have a clue of where they are or strategies on involving them with anything, right? So this conversation, as I said at the beginning, is coming up for the 2020 census because we're facing the same challenges we did almost 6 years ago, right? We know demographic changes are happening. We see, for example, in Oakland, there's a Nigerian restaurant in East Oakland. There's tons of Ethiopian, Eritrean restaurants. Everyone has probably eaten it there. Those are all indications of demographic change, right, that are happening. People are engaging in businesses, and you probably know in your work site 1 or 2 people. These are all evidence of how this change. Communities are coming, new immigrant communities that are Black are coming, but we don't have a clue on, okay, so I see them here and there, but how are they structured? What is the leadership? And how do we develop a relationship with them? And one of the good examples is, when Census 2010 was going on, and this issue of, okay, we need to get Black men who are one of the least engaged, profiles on the census. They said, well, go to the barbershops. That's where the conversations are happening about anything. Go to the barbershops. So when Dorithia and I were preparing for this, one of the sort of solutions is to even identify, I said at the beginning, that we never get invited and to come present and to speak about the community that exists. So this is a good beginning. And then the second is, as I said earlier, there are community groups, meetings that are happening, whether they happen at public spaces, someone's home, in a coffee shop. I could tell you where the Tanzanian community is happening. I can tell you where the Congolese community is happening. And each and every one of these events has public events, fundraising events, usually celebrating either the independence of the country or the Yam Festival. And we also know typically when these events are being planned, the women are in a particular space, either cooking or preparing, right? So I'm not here to critique, oh, that's not a woman's place and let's talk about that. That's for another time. But if you want a critical mass of Nigerian women, you know where to get them. You know where the spaces are. So when there is, say, information you want to share about STDs or domestic violence, you don't do a call out and say, oh, we're doing this and we're focusing on African women, come. I can tell you from experience, if 2 come, you're happy, you're lucky. So knowing where they are and knowing what's culturally likely to work, to gain the trust, and to say whether it's on housing issues or health issues, where are the communities, where do they meet, and how do we begin to engage with them? So that's my sense of a real organic, solution-oriented process. It's not going to be, oh, you need to do A, B, and C. It's recognizing, visibilizing the communities and trusting them to have the solutions and listening to them. So it's not to say, okay, we've got this program and I want you to be an audience and let me tell you what we're going to do. Mm-hmm. It's like, tell me about you. Tell me about the culture. Respect and listen, and you will learn, because it's a two-way street, right? Because this talking to happens way too much, and I can tell you from our community, very hardly enough space to open up and say, I'd like to learn about your community. The last thing I'll say is, Dorothea mentioned it at the beginning, that we started out with the African Diaspora Dialogues. And this program came out when we started working with the African community groups that are diverse and multiple issues, recognizing that what we were hearing in these trusted spaces about race and identity was making some of us feel very, very uncomfortable. So knowing that when we come to the United States, we are identified as Black, even though we say, no, I'm Ethiopian, I'm Nigerian, and that may be. We have to respect where people are, but also understanding the profound reality of how race affects them. We needed to have this conversation, which is why the Diaspora Dialogues was born. So I'll stop there.
And so for people who are concrete and want some concrete answers, go to the PTAs. Everybody has children and they're in the schools. And as Nunu says, you have to engage the community. So remember the outreach that you did back in the day when we hit the streets and we wanted women to understand that they had rights and domestic violence and sexual assault. That's what we have to go back and do. You cannot sit in your office and write beautiful position papers and do beautiful flyers. You have to go and meet your neighbors. So if you want, you want to help the woman that you know that is being beaten up in her home and nobody is talking about it. You have a bake sale or you have a cooking, you have an event and then you have people talking and you bring the material or you bring the conversation, but we have to know people. We did not get to this point not talking to women. We had to talk to women. Back 20 years ago when A Safe Place started, it's where I started, we were talking in the streets. We were sitting down and we were talking to women. We were talking to women who worked in the streets, talking to women who worked in the kitchens, talking to women, and we had to. And so that's the same thing. If you really want to work with this community, as Nunu says, we have to not talk, but we have to listen. And you have the same old thing. Human beings are human beings all over, and they respond to sincere communication. And so those are the answers. I'm sorry we don't have any glowing answers, but those are the same answers. The same kind of grassroots work we did in the past is what's needed for this community today. And
And that's
you
our
all.
call to action right there.
Right.